Can Emmanuel Macron survive the biggest challenge to his presidency? Barricades burn in Paris for a third successive Saturday of fuel tax protests and calls for the president to resign. How can he solve the crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The Arc de Triomphe daubed with graffiti, the Champs Elysee cloaked in clouds of tear gas. It's all becoming a familiar story in Paris. The famous site of the French capital turned into a battleground for a third successive weekend. Yellow vest protesters again venting their fury at the rising price of keeping their cars on the road and increasing calls for President Emmanuel Macron to resign. Facing the biggest challenge to his 18-month presidency, he flew home from the G20 summit in Argentina for an emergency government meeting. It's not just next month's proposed fuel tax rise which is infuriating many, falling living standards are too. David Chater has this report from Paris.
The Yellow Vest rebellion once more brought the streets of central Paris to a standstill. Water cannon, tear gas and stun grenades were used by the riot police to try and disperse the protesters in a series of running confrontations. This time it was the Arc de Triomphe that was the focus for some of the fiercest clashes. The iconic symbol of France, occupied and defying the country's laws.
We had the Arab Spring. Now we are getting the European winter.
As the day drew on, the violence in the surrounding avenues saw police vehicles and cars being torched and even buildings set alight. It was meant to have been a peaceful protest. A small minority carried out the attacks. The rest were demanding the resignation of President Macron.
The Yellow Vest rebellion will continue not only into the night but into the next week, and once again could actually become a real threat politically to President Macron's administration.
From a platform in Argentina, though, he had a defiant message for them.
Aucune cause.
No cause justifies that security forces are attacked, shops pillaged, public or private buildings set on fire, pedestrians or journalists threatened, or that the Arc de Triomphe is sullied.
The protests were even more violent than last week's demonstrations. There were more arrests and more injuries. There seems little chance of reconciliation anytime soon. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Let's bring in our guests now today. In Paris, Anne Giudicelli, a CEO of Terrorisc, a consultancy firm focused on global risks and strategic intelligence, and also a former French diplomat. In Istanbul, Remi Bourgeot, an economist at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs, also an investment strategist. And via Skype in Coventry, David Lees, a lecturer in French studies at the University of Warwick. Very warm welcome to all of you. Anne, first to you, because you were with us last week talking about these protests. They were much more violent this weekend. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, because it's the result of the fact that the government has not addressed properly what is going on and the nature of the demonstrators' claims. That's the reason why the movement has been radicalized due to the lack of, let's say, a strong gesture coming from the government. So they feel that they have to go further in violence in order to be heard. It's what we can say to explain.
But Anne, we need to be careful here at this point, don't we? Can I just jump in there, just to clarify, as our correspondent David Chater has been keen to point out, that there are two distinct groups of people on the streets of Paris. You've got the Yellow Vest movement, which are peaceful protesters, and then you have far-right, far-left extremists and anarchists mixed up, and they are the main cause of the violence, aren't they?
Yeah, but I mean, you have always in any demonstrations, you have always radical groups like left wing or right wing. So I mean, I was just saying that I mean, even the peaceful people, they have been radicalized due to what I said previously. Of course, you have always groups, violent group, which has nothing to do directly to the claims. But after, it's also due to, let's say, the way how the security has been set up for, I mean, to prepare this demonstration that has been, I mean, announced 1 week ago. So, I mean, it's very difficult to arrange to set up a good security system when you don't know exactly where the demonstrator will go. So there is a reason why they couldn't anticipate on, I mean, what place to secure and how many people will be there and so on and so on. So
Remi, if I could just bring you in at this point, just to get an idea from you, Remi, how you feel the government has handled this crisis so far.
Well, they didn't expect the demonstration to last and to become so widespread throughout the country. So they're really caught by surprise. They didn't want to abandon those tax hikes. And now they say it's too late to do so. So they don't have a clear strategy at this point to deal with this protest. Just a few months ago, after Macron's election, there was this kind of consensus about his structural reforms and his European agenda. But all of that is stalling at the moment, and there's a clear lack of a strategy, both an economic strategy that could also benefit those social groups and the working class in particular, and a more political way to address this huge dissatisfaction within society. So it's clearly a turning point for this presidency, and this element of surprise that prevents them from tackling the situation effectively.
David, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the government, where it's falling down, where it's failing, is in its delivery of its message as to how these economic reforms will benefit the people of France?
I would absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far, yes. I mean, I think Macron is really proving himself to be, or to appear, somewhat aloof at the moment. You know, he doesn't seem to really understand the genuine concerns of ordinary working people. And I think it's something which has been the case really ever since he was elected. We do, of course, have this significant sort of divergence between the very real popular sentiment in France at the moment, which seems to be very much a sense of discontent around these increased taxes on diesel in particular, and of course the political landscape in France. Macron has a huge majority in the National Assembly. Any major reforms he wishes to try and implement in French political and economic terms can be implemented without any major opposition politically. But in terms of what he's actually trying to achieve as it's appeared across the whole country and in terms of ordinary voters, there's a real sense of aloofness and uncertainty. And I think he really does have this real issue in terms of communicating in an earnest and meaningful way with ordinary voters.
Would you agree with that, Anne? I mean, would you say that the problem with President Macron is more down to his style than his substance, that perhaps he does come across as too arrogant, but the reforms that he's trying to implement are necessary for France?
Well, I think, first of all, there is no lack of strategy. I think that his position is that he has been elected for his program, and his program is to, to implement reform. His program is based on how to reform the country. So now he's in a tricky situation, in the meaning that he doesn't want to be like the previous government, meaning government which usually pull back for any kind of reform. The difference is that now the way how the people demonstrate that they disagree is no more through political representative, like May or lower layer and so on. So, I mean that he is in a direct confrontation with the people, which is very new. So, I mean, there is a lack of communication because you have no more mediation with the political representative, local or regional, and so on. So, I mean, he's in this tricky position in the meaning that he has been elected for being different than the other, but finally, he has to show that he has understood properly the people, that pulling back from his, changing his program will be a good situation, good gesture, just to cool down the situation. Otherwise, we are going to have people more and more radicalized.
Okay, let's get an idea from Remi as to whether Macron at this point in time is actually going to be willing to change his programme, because he hasn't given any indication that that's the case.
Well, he's really sticking to this kind of checklist of structural reforms, and that's one of the problems, actually. This approach that consists in trying to check all the boxes in that checklist, and there's a lack of a more profound economic strategy, especially in this time of industrial revolution, of great technological change, and those structural reforms. Some of them do make sense, but they are a little too generic, too systematic, and all the reforms everybody has been speaking of for the past 20 years, and now times have changed. There's been a global financial crisis and a concern about inequalities and an array of issues. So people fail to see really what will what kind of impact these reforms will have in terms of long-term growth and how they will improve their living standards. And there are really existential concerns about housing and jobs. You can see now that the demands of the demonstrators are broadening very fast on the minimum wage, all kind of issues. It's not so much just about some very precise reforms, but more about the more general approach and the concern that those reforms are not really addressing other people's concerns or the more general challenges for the country in terms of strategy.
David, just give us an idea of who the Yellow Vest movement is made up of and their concerns, how legitimate they are. I mean, how genuinely are people struggling to live in France?
Well, I think part of the issue is no one really knows exactly who is part of the movement. And of course, there is no clear leader, which makes it very hard, as we've been hearing actually, to negotiate with the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, because there is no clear leader figure. But I would say they're made up of a kind of a diverse group of people from across, it seems to me, across the political spectrum, who are genuinely disillusioned with the cost of living, with the limited purchasing power, as the French would say, the lack of having your monthly wage going as far as you would like it to go, and the real concerns around jobs, around employment and so on. I think where the protests have been most significant, actually, and most, I guess, most led by the people themselves, is around the kind of more rural parts of France, particularly areas away from Paris, where the genuine concern is that money from Paris does not seem to be filtering down into these local areas, particularly more rural areas, so-called La France profonde, the kind of the sort of heartlands of France, really. The major focus, of course, in terms of the media and so on, has been very much on the Paris-based protests. But as we've been discussing, that's really been infiltrated to some extent by extreme left and extreme right agitators. Elsewhere in France, there are genuine concerns around Macron's ambitions in terms of economic policy. And as we've been hearing, a lack of communication in terms of how these policies are being communicated it really is having a major impact on how the public perceive Macron and indeed his policies as a whole.
It was quite interesting, and last week we saw President Macron trying to be more empathetic and more humble in the speech that he gave to the nation. Did any of that resonate with people?
Well, I think what has done yet the government is not properly addressing the level of, and the real demand. The people in the street, they ask for now a solution, now a decision from the government. What the government has proposed for the moment is just in 3 months, we will have, during the 3 months coming, we'll have a discussion dialogue at a local level and then at a regional level and so on and so on. But, well, I think it has to give something now that will just help the process of cooling down the situation, and then it will be able to propose something that can be established, set up for the next weeks or next months coming.
And what can he do
people
now?
Are waiting
what
for
is it that he
kind
can
of
offer people
gesture.
now?
Well, you know, if people ask for Macron has to leave and so on, it's because they are still waiting for something from him, not even the government, from the president himself. He has to pull back on 1 point or 2 points, which is taxes, about salaries, and because for the moment the agreement of the government agreement is to say that we will allow the people to have less money to spend, but people are asking for getting more money to spend more, by the way. So that's the point, and he has to give 2 or 3 major decisions that fit with the claim, and that has to be done very quickly.
Okay.
Otherwise, we'll have the same or even worse next week.
They will keep growing. Remi, do you think Macron is actually in a position to do anything right now?
Well, it's difficult now. It's never too late. But even when he's tried to address these concerns, to see more, to show more empathy, his message was still quite mixed. And it's very difficult given his whole approach to really adapt to those concerns and to this social dissatisfaction, which is really here to stay. It's not just about those petrol taxes. It runs much deeper, and it's really about very profound fears about people, not only living standards, but jobs, housing, an array of issues. And the problem is that his political agenda doesn't really address those concerns and more general issues related to growth. And there's been this focus on European reform, for example, on the Eurozone, and this is stalling also, and that doesn't also really solve any of these economic issues. So there's really a need to recenter the message and the strategy to really address people's concerns. But going along with the current strategy will certainly not solve this situation.
I mean, it's interesting, Remi, isn't it, that Macron came straight from the G20, visited the Arc de Triomphe, which was covered in graffiti, and then went straight into an emergency crisis cabinet meeting, which we understand that the cabinet is still holding as we go to record this programme. As they went into that meeting, there was talk of reimposing a state of emergency in France. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the kind of answer that Anne is suggesting is needed. It's more stick than carrot. But do you think it's likely that the state of emergency will be imposed?
Well, there's a security situation right now, and they have to deal with that. I mean, in city centres and in Paris in particular. So the message is obviously very bad. I mean, in terms of how the government is dealing with this situation. But the problem is this movement is very diverse and has no kind of central leadership of any kind. So it's very hard to tackle this. So they have to take security measures on the one side, but the most important part on the other side is to address those social concerns, and that's the only effective solution to tackle those demonstrations and those unrest in the end.
Dave, we've been talking about how these protests are sort of kind of unwieldy. We don't have any leadership. We don't know who's driving them. They came seemingly from nowhere via Facebook. But how likely that they will get more organised, that we'll see trade unions, for example, coming on board, and then it becomes a much more concerted and perhaps worrying movement for the government?
Well, in some ways, I think having trade union involvement or indeed having more mainstream political involvement might be a good thing for Macron, because it actually would focus negotiations with a central leadership figure or with a group of people. The real risk, I think, actually, is that the movement continues to be, in complete, as it were, disarray without any clear leadership, because for Macron, that's much harder to deal with than being able to sit down around a table with a group of people he may already know. We hesitate to draw comparisons here with the events of May 68 because these are in many ways very different. But in May 68, the movement didn't really have a central leadership for a long time. And when the unions got involved, that's when Charles de Gaulle and his Prime Minister Pompidou were able to actually negotiate with those leadership figures. And really, they took the sting out of the movement in a significant way. So I think in many ways, Macron would welcome having trade union involvement and indeed having more sort of mainstream political involvement, because it does take away from the sense of this being a popular and indeed kind of a movement which transcends political boundaries.
Because it is a popular movement, isn't it? I mean, we've got more than 75% of French people supporting the protesters and only 30% of people supporting Macron. I mean, do you think, Anne, that we're going to see the yellow vests keep up this momentum? Will we be here next week having this discussion?
Well, the coming week will be very important to have an idea about what will go on next Saturday. Sure, there is an attempt from the Yellow Vests to organize themselves and to not to be really directly now connected with trade unions and other, because they don't trust really all kind of previous organization like trade unions or local political representatives. So at least we see now that they try to set up a kind of group of representative, yellow vest representatives, able to at least have a united list of what are the main claims to present to the government. So, and there is many meetings that are already announced for this week. So let's say that I think that trade union and other mediators has not to be yet involved in the next step. That has to be done from inside the Yellow Vest, and there is some are trying to do quickly something which can help also the government.
Remi, one of the key protest chants is that Macron must resign. How much of a threat is his presidency facing right now?
Well, that translates a very deep dissatisfaction. It's not a realistic demand and not a realistic prospect, of course, but it really shows how much these demonstrators are infuriated by those policies and feel abandoned, and that the tax pressure has really gone too far. That's just one element. And you mentioned the support, the popular support for these protests, and it really shows that there's no way but to really address those concerns on the economic front. And trade unions are largely relegated. And that's what's really daunting here. It's that this movement is totally decentralized. They're trying to organize in a certain way, but that's still very far from being the case.
Okay.
The only.
Okay, yep, I'm just going to jump in there because unfortunately we have run out of time. It's been a really interesting discussion though, and as Anne says, it'll be a very interesting week to follow the events in France closely. Thank you very much for joining us today, Anne Giudicelli, Remi Bourgeot and David Lees. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.